Welcome to the Cliffe Explosives Works. From above, for the most part. This is something of a counterpart to my other video on the Cliffe Explosives Works. If you haven't seen that yet, that's more of a kind of a broad overview of the history here and some of, well, many of the accidents that happened during its roughly 30-year history. So if you haven't watched that yet, you don't necessarily need to watch it before this one, but I think these videos make a nice little pair. So if you haven't, finish watching this and then go and watch that one if you like. I'll add a little link to it down there in the description. So, this is the old Cliffe Explosives Works. And from above is really the best way to appreciate just how large the eventual Curtis's and Harvey's factory was. By the end, it covered around 128 hectares of marshland, and rather than being a conventional factory with buildings all clustered together, this was of course a lot more scattered across the landscape for very good reason. As we've discussed in many videos, it's usually a good idea for a lot of buildings containing a lot of flammable, combustible material to be as far from each other as possible. And apart from that separation in the buildings, one of the other clear things you can see straight away is those little kind of, well, from here, what look like little raised lines running between the different buildings. And a lot of those are the remains of the factory's old tramways. They tended to use those tramways with little bogies or, train carts to move the materials from place to place throughout the process. And what we'll see again and again are many of those strange looking circular and also in some places rectangular earthworks, and they are known as traverses, essentially a very blunt way of trying to protect other buildings from another building exploding, by basically building huge banks of earth around those buildings. Now thankfully there was a huge archaeological survey done of this site, because old site maps that list what each of the buildings were may exist somewhere. I don't think that archaeological survey was able to find those, and I wasn't able to find those, because the best source of information for what we have here is that survey, and they're kind of, very informed guesses as to what each of these buildings was for. So here we can see structures 1 and 2. These are very important because they are the oldest factory structures that still survive here today, dating way back to the original Hay Merricks and Company works that were here in the early 1890s, before Curtis's and Harvey took over. And so in these structures we see the very beginnings of this site, and at this point gunpowder that was manufactured in Scotland was brought down here to be blended, packed and stored. Structure 1 here later became known as Magazine Number 2, while Structure 2 was known as Blending House Number 12, and both, as with a lot of these structures, were eventually reused as the factory grew and evolved. So here is essentially where the story of this whole site begins. Moving slightly further across and closer to the Thames, we'll see a couple of rows of slightly smaller earthworks. That survey identifies these as structures 3 to 14, and that they were probably cartridge-filling huts. Then 15 and 19 nearby appear to have been associated with the manufacture of blasting explosives. And these buildings, as with many other buildings and explosive factories, would have probably been lightweight wooden structures, and of course have now disappeared, but they were often built that way so that if they did explode, the damage would be a lot less than if it was a brick building flinging heavy debris everywhere. And what survives, as we see a lot, are the platforms or foundations on which they stood, along with that earth deliberately piled around them. Really was often the case that a lot of this kind of dangerous work was basically done in little sheds. And this area could be particularly interesting because this is the most likely place to have been where 2 female workers were killed in 1908. Now, as you'll see in my other video, we can't say exactly where they were working, but this area right here was where the exact kind of work they were doing would have happened. This next brings us across to structure 31. Now this was nicknamed Nitroglycerin Hill. The earthwork around the outside rises to about 3.2 meters and is roughly twice the height of a lot of the surrounding traverses. Inside it, like with our cartridge-filling huts, would have been a lightweight 2-story building. And this was a a particularly dangerous spot, because this is where acids and glycerin were brought together to produce nitroglycerin. Now, of course, the building itself is gone, but this large traverse tells us exactly how dangerous this particular building was. And Historic England records do associate it with a serious incident in 1911. However, the little bit we have from what remains of the official accident account places the actual explosion that took place here outside a final wash house. So it wasn't necessarily structure 31, but one of these little ones around it. And so of course this makes structures 30 and 32 here potential nitroglycerin wash houses. Once the nitroglycerin had been produced in structure 31, excess acids had to be removed through washing it. And originally in these spots here there would have been freestanding circular timber buildings. Those have of course gone, but these substantial brick walls and in some cases the entrance tunnels still remain visible. Close to here is structure 27. Now, its precise function isn't certain, but Historic England assumes it was probably associated with the nitroglycerin mixing or processing that was going on nearby. And this one's quite interesting because it has this kind of twisted C-shaped traverse protecting kind of, almost over three sides of the building. And then another kind of separated bank protecting the last side. As we move down south, we find another part of the production process. This area was mainly associated with acid handling and the manufacture of guncotton. Now, the survey couldn't quite work out what the purpose was of all of these surviving foundations, but roughly they assumed that it was probably associated with nitration, washing, and processing. And the closest they really get to kind of pinpointing what some of the buildings were for is structure 39 and 63, which may have been used for guncotton nitration, or for washing and pressing it. We still can't be sure. And then some of these nearby structures surrounding it were probably something to do with acid storage and possibly power generation.
As we're going around here, if you're noticing any buildings where you're like, Tom, you just completely skipped over this building, what was this? This was obviously a huge site, and not all the buildings were used for processing, so there were a lot of administrative buildings here as well. And it appears that sections like this here were basically purely for the administrative work that was happening around the factory. And some people, managers, supervisors, were also living here. There were private residences here as well. And cheeky plug for the other video, if you watch that other video, you'll find out about this private residence, which was ultimately the manager's residence on this site, but that has an incredible history all of its own. And then slightly further south, right down the bottom, we have another few rows of structures. A quite regular looking pattern of little earthworks. Now, a lot of these structures, 59 through to 93, have all been interpreted as being cartridge-filling huts. And we might not be able to see most of the buildings, but we can still see how they were very neatly arranged and separated. And then right at the bottom, we have structure 95. A small barrel vaulted building that the survey interpreted as being an expense magazine, which would have been a small store used for the particularly sensitive explosive components that would be required throughout the day's work. Now, heading slightly further southwest, we have two interesting buildings, structures 103 and 104. Now, these appear today as large circular hollows. The Archaeological Survey tentatively interprets them as being the remains of exploded nitroglycerin buildings. Now, we're not sure what accidents may have occurred here, so we can't connect them to anything in particular. But what is a little odd is that they are so far removed from almost everything else in the site. Okay, let's go all the way back up north to this very unique, distinctive looking Y-shaped group of buildings. These were structures 106 to 114. And what we're seeing here is the manufacture of cordite. Structure 107 could have been an incorporating house, and structures 108 and 109
were interpreted as being cordite press houses. And then finally here, structure 110 appears to have housed a pump and hydraulic accumulator. The press houses were where the cordite dough was forced through dies, producing the long cords from which cordite takes its name. And because obviously those processes needed quite a lot of hydraulic power, that pumping equipment was positioned nearby. Now, just alongside our Y-shaped collection of buildings was structure 129, which is of particular interest because, as in my other video, we can connect this directly to a fatal accident. Originally, this was a range of 10 cordite drying stoves, which was later altered to contain 20 acetone-recovery stoves. And during the process of that conversion, a labourer called John Gear was killed. It was 1914, and apparently Gear had been working with a chisel that may have encountered a tiny quantity, a tiny film of nitroglycerin. Then that went on to ignite more nitroglycerin and caused a devastating explosion. Moving on to the middle, we have this selection of quite regular foundations, quite regularly shaped and placed traverses here. These were structures 139 to 152 and were associated with guncotton drying. And alongside structures 143 to 154 were groups of cordite drying stoves. Guncotton needed to be dried before it could be incorporated into cordite. And then once the cordite was finished, it needed to be dried as well. And that brings us on to our wartime expansion. And the scale completely changes. Everything we've seen so far was largely the original Curtis's and Harvey factory. But during the First World War, these works expanded dramatically to the east, ultimately becoming HM Cordite Factory Cliffe. And from above, the difference is quite clear. The early factory kind of developed more naturally, organically around the marshland it was in, and the wartime factory became much more efficient, much more regular, and was clearly expanded quickly. This lower area down here, which is incredibly regimented, structures 267 through to 283, and these appear to have been guncotton drying stoves, just a lot more guncotton drying stoves. And the sheer number of them here compared to the, few in the original factory just shows how much production was massively expanded after the demand created by the First World War. Then here, structures 256 to 263 were cordite paste mixing houses. Each of these mounds is where nitroglycerin and guncotton were brought together. Well, in other words, this was probably one of the most dangerous places in the entire factory. And once mixed here, the resulting paste would continue through the rest of the factory, eventually becoming finished cordite. These very flat remains of structure 251 here were the incorporating house. This is where that cordite paste was further processed with acetone and mineral jelly, turning it into cordite dough that was ready for pressing in those big hydraulic presses. Then we have 246 and 247. These were the cordite press houses. So after going through 251 being turned into that dough came into these buildings. Each building contained 9 press positions, and in each one of these was the hydraulic machinery that was forcing the cordite dough through dies, producing those long cords of propellant. Then right outside these were structures 248 and 249. This was where the hydraulic accumulator and pump house were, and they provided the power needed to operate all of those presses. We then move along to 244 and 245. Once the cordite had been pressed, it still contained acetone, and these incredibly unique looking structures belonged to the acetone-recovery system. Structures 240 and 241 each contained 30 stove compartments. Structures 244 and 245 were even larger versions of those, with 58 stove compartments each. And this is where, rather than simply allowing the quite valuable acetone to evaporate away out of those cords, the factory recovered it here for reuse in the process. And again, these structures demonstrate the massive increase in scale that came with war. And finally, we come to what, from the air at least, is the most unmissable section of this massively expanded factory. This huge area with these buildings separated with far more space than in the old factory was the final stage of cordite production. These smaller structures, in and amongst it here, were the cordite blending houses. And here is where cords of the same diameter were brought together into batches. And once those cords had been blended together into their batches, every single one of these other rigid, regimented buildings here with these distinctive 4 chambers were more cordite drying stoves, with each one of them containing 4 cordite drying stoves. There's those 4 chambers we can see in each of these buildings. This is where that almost finished cordite sat to make sure not one tiny bit of remaining moisture remained in it. And once it had finished drying in this last massive stage of the process, it was ready to be moved into magazines and to leave Cliffe, and then eventually go on to find whatever unlucky bugger was going to be on the receiving end of it. And that was the end of the process. We can still see, we can still track across the landscape from structure to structure, from building to building, from ruin to ruin. We can still see every step in the process of making these devastating explosives here. And that's why the factory here at Cliffe is still one of the best surviving examples of a wartime explosives factory in the country. Well, thank you for watching. I thought this might make a nice little side piece to my other video on the explosives works here, because that was more of a, experiential video, whereas this is more of a, this is exactly what happened in each bit of this place, which I thought could be useful. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you did find it interesting, obviously go and check out the other video if you haven't already. But as always, like the video, subscribe to the channel. It really helps get these videos out to more and more people. And I'll see you in the next one.